like Iskandar in the video, I had always wanted to be a pilot, but by 16 I had to give up because I didn't meet the height requirements. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, in the name of Allah, the most compassionate, the most merciful. Mr. Lee Hsien Loong, Prime Minister of Singapore, Mr. Masagos Zulkifli, Minister for Social and Family Development, and Minister in charge of Muslim Affairs, distinguished scholars, religious and community leaders, ladies and gentlemen, very good evening and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and peace be upon everyone. Now, we are gathered here for very important conversations on the theme of developing successful Muslim communities. We had actually planned for this conference to take place before COVID-19 struck. If we had done so, the conversations would have been somewhat different because the pandemic has given it fresh impetus and greater urgency, reinforcing the importance of resilience and the meaning of success, that life is not just about self, but community. Not all about what we want, but what we need. And in life, we need to pause, reflect, and also we need silence. We survived the darkest moments of the pandemic by offering ourselves hope that if one door to goodness is closed, there are new ones that can be opened. We just need to know where to look. And one of the things that we have learned was that by being resourceful and creative, we could carry on with important things in life. So when we could not organize a conference of this scale like this evening, we conducted 2 online seminars to discuss lessons from the pandemic as well as the role of Muslims in secular societies. Some distinguished speakers who are present here spoke in these seminars and shared their reflections. And one important point that stood out was that religion is an important resource for resilience and social responsibility. We are eternally grateful for your participation, but more importantly for your friendship and support all these years for the work that we at MOIS, the Islamic Religious Council of Singapore, and the Singapore Muslim community do. Singapore is indeed a young and small nation, a tiny red dot. But the color red is as much about passion and commitment as it is about togetherness. So we do not walk this journey alone, but with friends and hopefully some fans along the way from all over the world. We are indeed very pleased to be able to host and meet you in person today. Allow me to say some welcoming remarks in Arabic for our guests from the Middle East. أيها الحفل الكريم وسادة الفضلاء نحمد الله سبحانه ونشكره على هذا اللقاء المبارك ونصلي ونسلم على من أرسله الله رحمة للعالمين. فإنه لمن دواعي سرورنا بأن نرحب بحضراتكم إلى هذا المؤتمر وإلى بلدكم الثاني سنغافورة. فقد ملأ القلوب الحنين إلى اللقيا والاجتماع بالأصدقاء والأحباب. ولا أقول إلا كما قال الشاعر: شوقي إلى لقياكم متزايد يزداد طولا ما تزايد نأيكم أي بعدكم. فسنغافورة قد جمعتنا أجساما فلعلها تجمعنا أيضا قلوبا وأفكارا للحوار حول قضية ذات أهمية بالغة، وهي قضية الفلاح والنجاح وبناء المجتمعات المسلمة الناجحة والمتميزة في واقعنا المعاصر. وكلنا يعلم بأن هذا الواقع الذي نعيش فيه له خصائصه وله تحدياته بل واضطراباته. ويظن البعض مثلا بأن هناك فجوة بين الدين والواقع المعيش. إذا غابت عن الأنظار بعض معالم الدين وشعائره الظاهرة، يظن البعض بأنهم يعيشون في مأزق وفي بيئة غريبة بل محاربة للدين. ولكنهم إذا أمعنوا النظر في القيم المعنوية التي يعيش بها أو يعيش عليها ذلكم المجتمع، فسوف يدركون بأن هذه القيم إنما هي قيم طيبة مشتركة بين الجميع، وسوف يدركون بأن هناك انسجاما واندماجا بين الدين والواقع. ولما لا؟ ولما لا أيها الإخوة؟ وشريعتنا تهدف إلى تحقيق مصلحة الإنسان في كل زمان ومكان، وتدعو إلى دفع المفاسد والمضار. وهذه هي المقاصد التي تمسكنا بها وطبقناها عملياً طيلة مواجهتنا للجائحة الماضية. وفي سياق التحديات المعاصرة ذات أبعاد متنوعة، قد أصبح الحوار حول بناء المجتمعات الناجحة والمتميزة ضرورياً. هذا الحوار أصبح ضرورياً، فنتطلع إلى مشاركتكم خاصة عن خبراتكم الثرية في بناء المجتمعات المسلمة الناجحة في بلادكم أنتم. ولعل هذا المؤتمر يكون خطوة بدائية نأخذها لكي نرتقي جميعاً إلى التفوق والنجاح في المستقبل، وأن تكون مجتمعاتنا المسلمة مساهمة في تطور البلاد والحضارة الإنسانية. وأذنوا لي بأن أكمل كلمتي باللغة الإنجليزية. Ladies and gentlemen, the pandemic has given us a crash course on the most important ingredients of success in a fast-changing world. Undoubtedly, there has been much pain, suffering, and disruption, but it has taught us one of the most, if not the most important thing, the worth of human life, that one life lost is one too many. I recall the Eid, or what we call the Hari Raya in Singapore in 2020, just after the pandemic struck. Mosques were shut in Singapore, like in many other countries. I stood in an empty mosque that morning to deliver the customary sermon, the khutbah, broadcast to the homes of Muslim families in Singapore. The air in the mosque was filled with sadness and longing for the community. There was no one there. We could feel immense emptiness. But I recall a story more than 10 centuries ago in Damascus. The Imam stood on the pulpit in an empty mosque, save for a handful of people, when a plague had struck the city. The Imam asked, where are the faces? أين الوجوه التي كانت بالأمس? Where are the faces who were just here the other day praying? Someone stood up and said, they all had perished because of the plague. They all had died. Only we have survived. During the pandemic, we missed the community dearly, but we took comfort in the fact that they were safe at home with their families. So more than just a crisis or a passing storm, the pandemic tells a compelling story of resilience, adaptability, and solidarity. For a small but very diverse nation like Singapore, our success hinges on our collective ability to quickly adapt to changing circumstances and conditions, to stay resilient and united, guided by our principles and values as we navigate change, and to remain connected with each other and care for one another with charity, compassion, and hospitality. In Singapore, faith communities, which are an important aspect of our social fabric, embody and reinforce these values. So during the lockdowns and the circuit breakers, there was some doubt if religions could survive the pandemic when places of worship had to be closed, because there was no divine revelation that says, thou shalt social distance. So some said faith communities would quickly lose relevance because of the pandemic. I disagreed back then, because in our scripture, there is an even more important revelation if we only knew where to look. A revelation that asks of us not only to social distance, but to wear masks, vaccinate, and take all the necessary safety measures to save lives. When the Quran says, وَمَنْ أَحْيَاهَا فَكَأَنَّمَا أَحْيَا النَّاسَ جَمِيعًا, whoever saved a life, it is as if he has saved all of humanity. We are very thankful that faith groups in Singapore remain resilient, adapted, and implemented safe measures for the greater good of society and to protect lives. But beyond that, something special happened here in Singapore. Religious leaders expressed solidarity and support for each other. And faith communities could draw strength from this togetherness, even as we could not meet in person at a time when anxieties were high, when a lot of people had gone through mental challenges. I am deeply thankful for our religious leaders for your constant support and encouragement, and for your letters of solidarity for our Muslim community here in Singapore. Through the crisis, we have engendered greater trust and confidence in each other and grown stronger together. But these experiences during the pandemic are not an exception to the rule, but a culmination and testimony of our social norms, especially when we are severely tested. That we are able to live together peacefully as a multi-religious and multicultural society, able to work together to build a safe and prosperous home for everyone, to respect each other and care for one another, and to be able to come together and express solidarity in times of crisis. And for the Muslim community here, this is the social context we live in. And no doubt it is unique and gives rise to particular and sometimes unprecedented theological, jurisprudential, and existential questions. Because we acknowledge that there are religious doctrines, traditions, and ideologies that may not sit well with aspects of our contemporary condition. There are episodes in Muslim history, and some are reenacted by some groups today, that raise questions on the role of faith in these environments, because faith has been used to seek dominance, control, and power, or to fight for rights so that only our norms and values prevail. But could faith be the catalyst and impetus to create a prosperous and harmonious society that benefits as many people as possible with justice, fairness, equality, and progress? Now, to answer these questions, Muslims will look to the Sharia, because the Sharia is a comprehensive system of religious values, principles, and laws. So how would the Sharia respond? What is the theology that instructs our behaviors and informs our attitudes in living in modern and diverse societies? How do we interpret our religious laws to respond to our unique context? And what does our religious identity look like as citizens of a modern secular state? How the Sharia responds to these questions depends on our social compact. Because what the Sharia does clearly is to provide the necessary foundations. The Sharia is vast, it's expansive, it's empowering. It's not insular, it's not parochial, it's not inhibiting. And the sum total of the Sharia is it pays enormous attention and sensitivity to the human condition. It exhorts humankind to protect and enhance welfare and well-being. And everything that the Sharia sets out for its followers to do is never outside the realm of human life and society, but within it and for its benefit. And this is, to use the term of the influential medieval theologian Al-Ghazali, Imam Al-Ghazali, maqsood al-shara', the intent of the Sharia, which is to protect the 5 fundamentals: religion, life, intellect, progeny, and property. And in one of the most extensive commentaries of a prophetic hadith, la darara wa la dirar, do not harm or repay one harm with another harm, the 14th century jurist, Imam Najmuddin al-Tufi, argued that the Sharia is all about the avoidance of harm. There can be no rules in the Sharia which can invite harm to the believer. We can add to this many other beautiful articulations of the protection of these fundamentals, the maqasid, by Imam Ash-Shatibi, Ibn Qayyim, and many others. And many of you scholars will be aware of these wonderful articulations. But we need to put it in practice. So where and how do we place the human condition and the human interest, the human welfare, in relation to the divine? Is it at the center of the religious worldview? Or is it at the margins and periphery as we have been used to learning? Can we read the maqasid of Al-Ghazali and Shatibi and the idea of the common good or the maslaha humanistically, as Tufi argues, alongside theologically? If we see the world from a binary lens with 2 distinct, irreconcilable realms or entities, then only one or the other would prevail. If a worldly life that functions on reason and rationality clashes with a worldview and laws from a sacred source, then we will always remain in conflict, both in our minds and with other people. Many medieval thinkers had tussled with this problem. Ibn Rushd, Averroes, Musa bin Maimun, Maimonides, and Thomas Aquinas in the Islamic, Christian, Jewish traditions. For them, the human intellect or reason has an important place in their own faith, and to varying extents, there are ways in which both can be harmonized. This challenge is even more acute today, as the gulf between religious norms and values and the liberal secular state seems to widen. If we let both drift further apart, if one makes no attempt to bridge the divide, we will end up with communities withdrawing and not participating fully. Because you have, on the one hand, an Islamic identity, and on the other hand, a non-Islamic realm, which in some ways, to use Durkheim's term, profane, where believers do not belong, at least not fully. Withdrawal means we become only concerned with protecting our own faith and demanding that our religious needs or rights must be met at all times as citizens. However, if we exercise a thoughtful reading of our religious traditions and teachings, we find that these aspects of modern life are not anathema to our faith. Our identities and allegiances to faith and nation do not need to conflict. For us in Singapore, we can be good Muslims, good neighbors, and good Singaporeans. As Prime Minister mentioned earlier, this is our unique Singaporean Muslim identity. But as PM said earlier as well, we need to adjust and adapt in our diverse society. In fact, the expectation that there should be no need to adjust or compromise is both unreasonable and unrealistic. It is very clear from Islamic history that this was never even the case during the Prophet's time. The Prophet asked the companions to migrate, some of them, to Abyssinia or Habasha in early Islam to seek a peaceful and safe life under the protection of a Christian king, Negus. Inna bi ardil habashati malikan la yudlamu indahu ahad. And some of them who have migrated to Abyssinia called Abyssinia home and did not leave the city, even after Muslims had settled in Medina under the leadership of the Prophet. In a similar way, the Prophet negotiated for a safe passage of Muslims to Mecca at Hudaybiyah by making some compromises. And this was controversial to even some of the companions, because he carefully considered the perspectives of non-Muslims, non-believers at the time, on the terms of negotiation. As odd as it sounds, faith truly becomes meaningful and purposeful when we have to make difficult choices, when we have to adjust, adapt, and negotiate in difficult situations. And for Muslims, remember, the more uncomfortable and challenging, the greater the reward. It is how we resolve these tensions, how we reconcile these differences, and how we forge a common path that would determine if we could ultimately work towards building successful communities. And these prophetic examples are consistent with how the Quran sets out the mutual and symbiotic relationship between community and state. Success depends on the level of trust, confidence, and support between the two. When the state offers its citizens a safe space to live and practice what they believe, then faith communities must do good and act honorably and with fairness. أَن تَبَرُّهُمْ وَتُقْسِطُوا إِلَيْهِمْ الْبِرَّ and الْقِسْطَ. And this, to me, is the clearest indication of the Quran's exhortation to work towards the common good, to strengthen the common good, founded on the values of goodness and fairness for everyone. Many of you here from different parts of the world may have different experiences, formula, and proposals on how to achieve this in your respective communities, and we have talked a lot about this since we met earlier this morning. For us in Singapore, faith communities are a significant part of our society, even as state governance and public institutions are secular. We are free to practice our own religion, including in the public realm, so long as the common good is not compromised and religion is not politicized. And every community, as it seeks to advance its own interest, places the collective good of society above all else. So this is the middle path, al-wasatiyya that we often as Muslims talk about. But wasatiyya is a delicate state of affairs. It requires that everyone plays their role judiciously. And this approach has given us confidence that we can thrive in Singapore and contribute to our nation's prosperity and progress. But we can only get to this point with confidence and competence in engaging with our unique context, not just for the leaders or the asatiza, but especially for the community. So in this regard, religious education and guidance must change. It must be empowering. And the responsibility of leaders and scholars is to work out the principles and values that can help the community make their own decisions when faced with their own unique problems. This is how our fatwa institution works today, where we try as best as we can. We refrain from just saying, this is halal, this is okay, this is haram, this is not okay. But we say to the community, consider these principles and apply it to your situation. Think for yourself too. Istafti qalba. But trust me, this is a lot more difficult than just giving straight answers. But with increasingly more circumstantial and complex issues, this is the way forward. Our international guests would have noticed by now we have a lot of halal certified food establishments, especially food chains, McDonald's, Burger King, and many others. And some, I understand, are very excited about this. But we can ensure it is halal. We can't say for sure it is tayyib, it's healthy. But we have launched campaigns to educate the Muslim public what halal actually means, which is different from what halal certification means. So this is an empowering approach for people to decide for themselves, not just rely on the halal logo and then say, I can eat this food. We have heard of horror stories where people have traveled overseas and called back Singapore and asking, can I actually eat in this restaurant in Hong Kong or in certain other places because I don't see a halal certificate? Don't call Muiz in Singapore to answer your question for a restaurant overseas. But that is a level of reliance and dependence, and I think it's time to change the approach to empower them as well. And this empowering approach is one of the many competencies we train our asatiza and future religious leaders after they graduate, when they take up lifelong learning courses to acquaint themselves with our context today. With empowerment comes the need for inclusivity. No one should be left behind in our pursuit for success. Of course, inclusivity is a huge topic and has many dimensions, some of which can be contentious and needs to be carefully discussed in the realm of religious thought. For example, how do we address intra-faith diversities and dynamics and different lifestyle preferences, as well as what I refer to as controversial and even confrontational hermeneutics? That is the interpretation of religion and its laws that challenge mainstream and traditional viewpoints. We are increasingly dealing with exceptionally complex issues, made more challenging by a social media that democratizes religious and social discourse. But these are not insurmountable if we learn to come together to discuss rationally and sensibly and to work out solutions for our community and our society. The religious positions we took during the pandemic were unprecedented, even controversial initially. But we worked closely with medical experts and listened carefully to scientific insights before issuing the positions of the fatwa. And around the world, if you recall at the time, there were communities which rejected science and medical guidance because they declared God is greater than the virus. So like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, Aquinas, and Maimonides, we need to find ways to reconcile between science and faith, that they complement, not conflict with one another. As we look back, perhaps what is emerging is a new model for success in a more open, complex, and nuanced world we live. The long-held notion of a dichotomous but conflicting and sometimes acrimonious relationship between the religious and the secular, between faith and science, between Islam and the secular state, do not necessarily reflect our social realities today. For example, within spaces which are largely defined or identified as religious in the traditional sense, the secular is present. On the other hand, faith communities take secular needs and interests seriously too, even as they practice their religions. And this conference, which we are in, is another clear evidence of how this nuance is at work. A nuance that is very much needed if faith communities and the state were to have greater trust and willingness to work with each other. And how we live today could very well have been a page from a book that Ibn Rushd or Maimonides would have written. There are many more complex challenges ahead. Our work to forge success cannot wait much longer. We all know that we have entered into a new phase of grave geopolitical and economic uncertainties, which can deepen social fault lines and chip away at social cohesion. But like other faith communities, I am convinced Islam too has a very important role to play in this historical moment. But this requires of us Muslims to have the courage and honesty to speak about our strengths and weaknesses and our gaps and blind spots. Because success will only flow from confidence in our own identity, by being authentic, comfortable in our own skin, and ready to engage with our socio-political context and realities on its own terms. Our generation has to chart its own path towards success, empowered by tradition, not incapacitated by it. This requires confidence and courage to read our traditions afresh, to think critically and co-create solutions creatively with others, with all segments of society. And this is broadly what we refer to here in Singapore as the 3 C's of success: character, competency, and citizenry. And tomorrow, in the conference proper, the panels have been arranged according to these characteristics, where they will be further discussed, and we look forward to your discussions. Allow me to end with a little admission that it is tough to be both a realist, yet remain staunchly hopeful these days. It's tough. The pandemic, the climate, the economy, and conflicts all make it feel like it's much easier to fail than to succeed. Like the odds are stacked against us. So much so that signs of giving up with Earth as our home are beginning to appear. I'm not sure if you all followed some of the documentaries on NASA's exploratory rovers on Mars. So it is not only deglobalization that we should fear, but de-Earthization, moving life away from Earth. We cheer scientific progress, no doubt, but the sense of desperation is becoming more obvious when scientists are searching for a new home in the lava tubes of our planetary neighbor Mars, a red, dusty, dry planet, and planning to leave this blue, magnificent world God has entrusted upon us. Whatever your views are on life on Mars, some of you might be very excited, but Earth is still our first and only home now, and most probably in our generation. Our communities live here on Earth. And even if there are Martians, we don't know, but if there are Martians, we do not know if they will welcome our presence. So we must fight tooth and nail to keep our communities and societies successful. We cannot afford failure. We must believe that we can succeed with God's grace and with our hard work and determination and coming together in collaboration. The crisis that we have been through, the pandemic, should bring us, as Ibn Khaldun suggests in the aftermath of the epidemics of his time, he wrote in his Muqaddimah, a world brought into existence anew, not a new world elsewhere in the galaxy, at least not yet. So we must fix the problems we have created here, not move these problems elsewhere. It will follow us if we haven't resolved them. So back to Earth, back to Singapore, and ending, let us take the first step towards that direction with this conference. The research program in the study of Muslim communities of success, RPCS in short, as Prime Minister mentioned earlier, aims to develop new epistemologies, new frameworks and knowledge for us to explore new frontiers in the intersections between faith and society. We have not given up, and we want to remain hopeful. So I call upon all of you to support and join us in this endeavor. We will start right away tomorrow morning in our 3 panels on character, competency, and citizenry. But before I end, please join me in once again expressing our deepest appreciation to Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, for gracing this conference and staying throughout this speech until the end. Thank you, Prime Minister. We hope all of you have a good rest. We're indeed very honored and inspired and motivated to do more, to achieve greater success. We hope you have a good rest this evening. We look forward to seeing tomorrow. Keep well. Thank you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.